Hello and welcome to CharitEpulse, your regular update on news and happenings in the charity sector. I'm James Saunders, I'm a partner at Moore Kingston Smith, and I'm joined as ever by my co-hosts Catherine Rastromji, partner and head of charities at Shakespeare Martineau, and Charles Mesquita, charities director at Quilter Cheviot. You may be listening to us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or YouTube, Amazon Music, or any of our respective organisations' websites. However you're listening, you're very welcome. Please don't forget to like and follow and subscribe, and generally hit any positive feedback button you can for us, presuming, of course, you do find these little sessions interesting and useful. We're going to start with the new fundraising code, which my colleague Dan Fletcher has been tweeting and or Xing rather, and LinkedIning about recently. It's been released. Catherine, I'll come to you first. Do you think it will impact much on charities, this new updated fundraising code?
I suppose to take the wording in your question, I think no, not much. I do think fundraising code, yes, obviously it's relevant, and for those charities that do undertake fundraising, I am sure they will be looking at it in detail, but it's not so far-reaching for all charities. It's not such a fundamental change. I did love that it talks that about being 45% shorter. I think we're obsessed now, aren't we, with the length of documents and then the sneaky way of shortening the main document and having everything in a separate guidance note. But take the point, I think, for it to be more focused and relevant and updated where it should be. But, I don't think it's going to be a massive change.
Yeah, I mean, it's purported to have gone through a significant update, but more it seems to reflect technological advances and evolving society behaviours, changes in legislation, rather than I think a major upheaval on the principles of what it is. It's never been just it's never been designed to be overly prescriptive, has it? Charles, any extra thoughts?
Yeah, I sat in or I attended the Trustee Exchange conference, and we had Gerald Oppenheimer, Connor Gibson, who's policy manager, and Nikki Renkin, who's head of casework, talking about this. And to my mind, if you can shorten it and simplify it, it definitely gets a big tick. I think if we take a step back, I think actually the fundraising regulator has been a great introduction to the sector. If you think about it, we had a number of scandals, particularly that lady in Bristol. And I have to say that with the introduction, I think they have handled, the regulation of fundraising extraordinarily well, and I think set good standards. So I think we should applaud what they have done. The fact that this is principle based, the fact that they look to simplify it, I think one should take it thing. And the other thing is, I took an opportunity on the back of something we were talking about a number of sessions ago, was about OMAs. And I have to say, Gerald Oppenheim gave a very good response to that. One is that they had actively engaged with them. Secondly, that the amount of money that has been raised through OMAS, and that they've recently published their report, and I think it's about 17% going to charity. Now, personally, I still feel a bit uncomfortable with the whole process, but it certainly gives you some reassurance around that you have a regulator dealing things in a robust way. And dealing with it very even-handedly.
Yeah, I don't think there's any surprise that there are investigations going on into OMAs, and given the murky backdrop, if you like, around the American funding and the American charity being suspended. So that's an interesting one. I just should say from update point of view, that new the new fundraising code is effective from the 1st of November 2025. So you've got a little bit of time just to get ducks lined up before it's absolutely enforceable. Charles.
Just one other thing I thought was interesting is that the majority of complaints are due to charities dropping through letterboxes, which I thought was, again, quite interesting. So, as a regulator, they've certainly been very collaborative. And you remember, again, we had that situation, didn't we, of that charity that had been effectively suspended from using the standard. And again, I think, they should be applauded in the way that they had handled that whole process, because they really had gone to great lengths to try and get the charity to respond and deal with the problem. And when they didn't, they then suspended. I have to say, I didn't ask whether their suspension had finished and that was back on, but they've certainly taken an attitude of being much more of a collaborative regulator.
Seems general thumbs up generally all round. Okay. In a similar vein, then, the new Charity Governance Code is also on the horizon, quite close on the horizon. It seems it might well be published later this year. In actual fact, in the next few months, perhaps. There's been a few ideas of what the key changes might be, but I think I wonder if it's been affected by a couple of the more recent governance board problems that have been reported at high level, thinking particularly of the Actors Benevolent Fund last year, and of course Prince Harry and Centre Barley most recently. I wonder if any of that's coming in. Catherine, any thoughts on this, as it's one of your sort of specialist areas?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not, I could be wrong, but I'm not expecting any massive changes. And I think with the governance code, most feedback is it is good. It's a useful tool, let it bed in, let it be useful. Don't keep on tinkering with it. I think both of the examples that you gave, I think though disputes in charities are particularly difficult. And that's where I think governance hasn't necessarily been created with a view to resolving disputes when they arise. I think the thought is, well, we're here to make decisions about a charity. We're not here to have different factions falling out with each other. So I think that's where the difficulties lie, because you realise that the governing document doesn't prescribe for this particular scenario and how are we going to resolve it. But I also think it's about trustees understanding what their role is and sometimes just walk away rather than dig in and have a long dispute. But, it will be interesting what the changes are. I think it's more likely maybe to reflect about having electronic meetings and how we're communicating by email more, and just realizing the changing landscape really of how trustees meet and make decisions.
Yeah, I mean, it seems that there's likely to be more focus, as you said exactly there, Catherine, on digital governance, but I suppose that reflects the nature of the wider scope: digital strategy, cybersecurity, data protection, all of that sort of stuff, which has changed so much since the last update. Environmental responsibility, and I always say the impact of your organisation on the environment, and vice versa, the impact of the environmental changes on your organisation, and linked to the fundraising regulator update, there is even more focus on stakeholders. One way or the other, making yourself more transparent, more open, and indeed that will also, all of that reflect in and be included in the update to the accounting regulations, the charity SORP, which is coming out probably towards the end of this year, the beginning of next year. That will be in play for 18 months' time, and that is going to follow the same pattern about governance. Keep saying that the major updates are likely to be around the front end of the accounts rather than the back end, rather than the accounting. There's two particular items around accounting, which is a time for another one. But this whole idea of governance evolves rather than necessarily a revolution to governance, I think, is key to all of these updates. Charles, any more thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, as we've discussed previously, I didn't think it needed any change at all. So I was certainly sat in that camp. I think the digital and the environmental one, I mean, the things that part of your governance anyway, so I'm not sure why that should be part of the principles of it. The one I'm interested in, though, is the enhanced stakeholder accountability, because I'm slightly wondering of what angle are they approaching that? And is that of how charities are engaging with other organizations? Because I have to say that is one area I am increasingly getting concerned about.
Yeah, I mean, the word stakeholder is very difficult, because I mean, where does it end? And kind of very different levels of stakeholders and involvements of stakeholders. So that, I think that's slightly dangerous. I mean, you're rather opening the doors to, let's say, complaints or tensions or disputes with people who could claim they're a stakeholder but have very, very little to do with an organisation. I can imagine a few MPs claiming that they're stakeholders in charities because it's public money.
But the one bit I'm getting really worried about is, and we're increasingly seeing it, you will see it in your professional capacities is that trustees are going out to tender more frequently, which in itself isn't. I mean, they should be reviewing their relationships, but do you need to go out for the full tender and beauty parade and everything else, where actually the people doing a job for you are doing a good job for you, and if they're not doing a good job for you, have you actually addressed the issue? And if you want to change, then why are you inviting them to? So I really worry that we've got into this sort of process where, from a good governance point of view, we must do this every 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, and it's wasting an awful lot of time and not focusing what you should. Where if you've got a good relation, people doing a good job for you, then maybe sense check the price to make sure that it's still fair and reasonable, and then move on.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think I like to think that most of my clients take the common sense approach and see we're doing a good job and reappoint us regularly. So that's all good from my side. Catherine, you were messaging us about the pro bono economics and commissions analysis on trusteeship that was released this last week or so. And interestingly, particularly not just the content itself, but the different ways people were reacting to the and dealing with the data or the report in the same report. I mean, do you want to talk us through that with sort of the different
I find it quite
interpretations?
amazing. Yeah, because the report itself is positive. It's entitled Trusteeship, a Positive Opportunity. And pretty much all of the stats were improving. So they're all moving in the right direction. So far, so positive. But I just found it fascinating, the bits that people would focus on and say this is terrible. So, for instance, the average age is 65 to 69, but it was 60 to 62 in 2017. So, okay, it's gone up a bit, but that's the average. 54% of trustees are retired now. It was 51% in 2017. There were new stats on racial diversity. There was no improvement, it said. There were new stats on disability. Though I do wonder where this information comes from, because I'm a trustee of 4 charities. Nobody's asked me about my racial origins or hidden disabilities. So quite where the information comes from, I don't know. The bit I obviously found absolutely hysterical on the, oh my God, the world's gone mad, was there was a comment that boards were lacking in legal expertise, and that was this kind of almost gaping hole, that boards needed trustees on there with legal experience so that they wouldn't have to buy in external legal advice. And of course, immediately I'm thinking, well, this is absolutely ridiculous. But also, I'm amazed that legal would be featuring so highly. I would often hear that it's financial, that you're looking for trustees with good financial acumen and knowledge that are needed for boards, rather than legal is a kind of, I wouldn't say it's a constant that's needed on a board.
And if that idea that you're putting someone on the board who's going to give you free legal advice, it's totally illogical, isn't it? It doesn't work at all. Charles, any thoughts?
Yeah, it was interesting because, again, at Trustee Exchange, we had a session on paying trustees, and they certainly referred to this, this survey that had gone out, and they were, picking out all the negativity of it. And then we had David Holsworth, Chief Executive of the Charity Commission, who did a keynote speech after lunch. And he, of course, was a bit like Catherine, of saying, actually, this is really encouraging, moving in the right direction, and everything else. So it's interesting how people are sort of using it and positioning it into whatever suits their book, to particularly for their story. So like Catherine, I have to say I've only skim read the report, but it seems to me everything's moving in the right directions. I think the real issues actually is around, and I'm finding this on the boards I'm sitting on, is that boards that I sat on 10, 15 years ago were predominantly retired people. Now that is becoming less so. And the issues we're having is, when should we meet? What sort of times of day? Because people are busy, and making sure that when we have meetings that they are very focused and we're getting on with stuff. So I think those sorts of dynamics, and also a much more scientific approach, I think, to who you recruit onto boards.
We debated paying trustees before, and I think we probably know where we all stand. I mean, I don't want to rehash the debate about right or wrong or yes or no, but Charles, do you feel that there is a movement towards the view that trustees should be paid, because that seems to be coming through. And I know it's easy to make, it's easier to make the argument for change than to make the argument for staying the same. But do you feel there's a move? I mean, Trustee Exchange that you went to, do you feel that there's a movement, that there's more, either those protagonists are more vocal or are more numerous?
So I think that's a really interesting question, because when I got I looked at the programme of Trustee Exchange, I was really surprised that we had payment of trustees as one of the leading, in fact, it was the first session we had of the day, because, I have to say, I'm not really coming across it for people doing it. So I was quite intrigued from that basis. And it was, again, we had Paul Latham from the Charity Commission on it, and Baroness Jill Pithartley, I probably pronounced it incorrectly, on there, and Mitta Deze, who is the CEO of the Young Trustees, who was very much so pro the payment. I think there is some confusion around expenses, paying for products and services. So I think a number of people charities been asked the question about, do they pay trustees? And I think they've answered yes, but I think they've answered yes, not necessarily to the right answer. The conclusion that came from it, I think that one was, I think we need to change the conversation around, and what do we get out of being a trustee? And I can say from a personal perspective, it has been hugely privileged to be there, of the people I've met, what I've learned, and certainly as an individual, I've become a better manager, a better leader as a result of it. And I think we tend not to necessarily think about what it is that we've got out of it. And I'm sure you'd have some comments on that. And the other thing, there was a gentleman there who's a chair of trustees who did make a very strong case of why a chair of trustees and the amount of time that they have to spend, or we have to spend as a chair, that some remuneration needs to be made. I mean, the Commission is very clear about this. They are not pro paying trustees, and I think it would definitely change the relationship. But there are certain circumstances where it is appropriate.
Yeah, I mean, when you say that, the Commission is against paying charities as a matter of course, you mean as a principle, you can pay with permission, and if articles allow.
Yeah. So I think the Commission's position is very much so that the principle of voluntary and the ethos of that leads. And I think also there is no real evidence that paying non-executive directors on boards actually lead to better.
I understand all that, but the question really was about, is there a groundswell moving towards, regardless of what the Commission thinks and says, amongst the those that could potentially be trustees and those that are trustees, is there a movement?
I think there are some people who are agitating for it, but I think it is very much so in the minority. And as I said to you, I was surprised it got the billing it did, and I was intrigued. And having walked out of that session, which was about an hour, I was no more convinced at the end of it than I was at the beginning that there was any real argument.
You're not the one you're never going to be convinced, are you, Catherine? What about you?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting angle, whether there is the groundswell or just a vocal group. And to give the example, when payment of trustees is billed as a topic, does it then have a ripple effect that people think, oh, actually, we should be talking about it? But I completely agree. It's a difference between paying for additional goods or services versus paying for your time spent volunteering as a trustee. I think that's completely different. And some of the discussions on LinkedIn, it was saying you would at least guarantee that people would turn up to meetings. And I just thought, you're just turning this into the House of Lords. Do you just get an appearance fee? You haven't read anything, you don't contribute anything, but if you turn up, you get 50 quid. So I thought it was, I don't think it's the answer. Yeah,
it's not the golden bullet.
No.
Okay.
But I think, but sorry, James, just on, I think the one thing the Commission was saying is that, that charities should be prepared to pay for expenses and make that. And there is a little bit of an ethos in the thing, is that because we're charities, we're poor, therefore people shouldn't claim. And I think we need to remove that sort of guilt bit out of it, because I think there are a lot of people who, if they're traveling and everything else, they should not be out of pocket for giving back to an organization, whether they're voluntary, whether they're volunteers or volunteer trustees. I don't think that matters. And I think charities need to change their attitude towards that.
It'd be interesting to know what percentage of charities do pay trustees. As I say, it's not a complete bar, is it? You can pay trustees with permission or with articles. So I wonder if anyone's done that.
They did come up with a number, actually, and I think it was 1 in 150, which I'd worked out of being 1,100 charities. But again, I'm just a little bit skeptical about the data, only because of how people will have responded to the question.
And indeed, if it is articles, it might have been set up in a completely different environment. It'll be an interesting little project to undertake. Okay, last bit. I mean, linked to paying and salaries and wages. An article just this last week about wages in the charity sector. Generally, there's a very high percentage being below the real living wage, which is obviously a really good guide as to how much people get paid in any particular organisation or sector. Catherine, I'll come back to you on that. Any particular thoughts on this one?
I thought what was lacking is I wanted a comparison between employers who are not charities, because I get it, if you're responsible as a charitable organisation, the gist of the article being you definitely should be paying it. But I just was not surprised in the slightest that charities are not paying it when we're hearing about them struggling to meet the increased NI contributions and just generally what a squeeze it is. I'm sure they would love to be able to pay the real living wage and want to, but I just thought it's a financial reality that they can't afford to. And I just thought it was a bit lacking that we didn't have a comparison to what proportion of non-charities are actually paying the real living wage, rather than some of the massive brands. Let's compare like for like between some of these SMEs. Are they actually paying it? So yeah, I thought it was useful to know. I think there is more of a piece as well, isn't there, about advertising charity roles and actually saying what the salary is, rather than not stating it, trying to get people for the lowest amount possible. So, there is a whole piece around salaries, I think, in the sector.
Yeah. And this was, just to add a bit of background, this is the Charity Job Salary Report 2025. And I was reading an article by Emily Moss in Civil Society, which was, and the headline ran, concerns expressed as quarter of entry-level charity roles pay below real living wage. So that's the context of this. As you say, Catherine, it's interesting to see who does pay the real living wage, or who says they are. A lot of the retailers do. I mean, that's certainly professional firms do. Tesco's, M&S, all those sort of places, they do. So, and if they're the sort of competition for those entry level roles, you can see why and how the base level salary is going to be higher, and very tempting to not go into. And it links back to when we had Emily on a couple of weeks ago. About that rewarding element, and indeed what Charles was saying, that rewarding element of working for charities. Charles, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very simple. We have a moral obligation as organisations that are there to do good, to pay fair wages. And if you want to recruit good people, you've got to pay them properly and pay them competitively. And if you don't, don't be surprised with what you end up with in the nicest possible way.
Well, of course, look, playing devil's advocate just for a second, plenty of organisations would say, well, either we can pay people a real living wage, or we can not do redundancies. If you've got a certain budget and you can't make ends meet, then you're going to be laying off people if you want to pay that higher rate than perhaps you necessarily need to.
But it's just not sustainable. And if the problem is that the grant funders aren't paying you the right amount of money, which means you're then having to put pressure on somebody's wages, so you're not paying them appropriately, that's just not a sustainable business model. So, I think we just need to be robust and honest about this. And again, I think, we've talked about this with CEO salaries, that the communication of this from both the commission and from the umbrella bodies and everybody else talking about it needs to be robust and have it supported, because we want good people and it's where the magic happens. And if you don't pay them properly, you won't end up with them.
Yeah. Okay.
Catherine,
any final thoughts?
Oh, I just think we're in dangerous risk of agreeing with each other on this session this week. I think, let's see what comes up for the next edition. But no, I think very sensible comments, entirely in agreement.
Yeah, we're definitely sort of coalition, all moving in the right same direction. Okay, so thank you. That's probably all we have time for this week. We've covered an awful lot there. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Charles. Thank you to the listener for tuning into this episode of ChariTepulse. We hope you found this all very useful. If you've got any questions or topics you'd like us to cover in future episodes, please do let us know. But whoever you are out there, whichever sort of stakeholder you are in the charity sector, we hope we're making a difference and aiming to ensure that there's something here for all of you. Don't forget, please, to follow us or leave a review or share our podcast with your network, and join us next time when we continue to explore challenges and opportunities facing voluntary organisations. Bye-bye for now.